In the spring of 1946, as the last embers of World War II cooled in the rubble of Europe, a man vanished. Not just any man, but a former German intelligence officer known only by the name Carl Schmitt. He wasn't listed among the war dead. He never stood trial at Nuremberg. No grave, no captured records. No whispers of defection to Moscow or exile in Argentina. He stepped into the shadows somewhere near the Austrian border and never came back out, and for decades, no one asked why. Officially, he didn't exist. His name wasn't on any prisoner lists or execution logs. He wasn't mentioned in the memoirs of fleeing Nazis or Allied intelligence reports. It was as if he'd been erased with surgical precision. But for a few in the intelligence world, the ones who remembered strange fragments, misfiled reports, or code names whispered once and never again, the story of Schmitt became something else. A ghost story. A riddle buried in the snow of the Tyrolean Alps. Then, in the winter of 2020, 74 years later, something surfaced. An unassuming cabin deep in the Austrian high country went up for sale after the death of an elderly recluse. The property was isolated miles from the nearest town, reachable only by winding roads and half-collapsed trails. A young couple, looking to escape city life, purchased it at auction. But when renovations began, so did the questions. Beneath the floorboards of the root cellar, behind stacked crates and rusted tools, was a false wall. Inside, sealed in airtight containers wrapped in oilskin and twine, were hundreds of yellowing documents, film reels, coded journals, and a Luger pistol still loaded. The labels were German. The date stopped in 1946. One file was marked Schmitt letzte Bewegung, translated simply as Schmitt final movement. The Austrian authorities were alerted. Historians were called in. And a story long buried under ice and secrecy was forced back into the light. Who was Carl Schmitt? What had he done? And why had someone taken such extraordinary measures to hide his past? The files raised chilling questions, but the man behind them, the ghost in the snow, remained a mystery. Until now, he wasn't born Carl Schmitt. That much is certain. The name was a fabrication, one of dozens used by German operatives during the collapse of the Third Reich. But this one stuck, not because it was true, but because it was used in the final moments before he disappeared. Schmitt was last seen in late February 1946 near the Brenner Pass, a cigarette tucked behind his ear, a forged Red Cross pass in his pocket, and a briefcase he refused to let out of sight. Traces of him exist like aftershocks, sharp, fragmented, and always out of reach. A hotel ledger in Prague signed K. Schmitt, dated March 1944. A surveillance photo in Vienna, half-blurred, showing a man in a black coat stepping into a shuttered cafe hours before it burned. A coded cable intercepted by British signals intelligence, referring to Stilljager or Silent Hunter, possibly his alias within the Abwehr Nazi Germany's military intelligence service. Later files suggest he may have shifted to the SS's Sicherheitsdienst as the war turned and loyalties grew fluid. He wasn't just an observer. Schmitt, if that was even close to his name, moved with purpose. Embedded with Wehrmacht officers in Berlin 1 month, slipping into occupied Paris the next. Some believed he helped orchestrate the evacuation of stolen art and gold toward neutral territories. Others whispered he had been turned by the British and was feeding them low-level intelligence, a classic double. But then, why vanish? By the war's end, he had no home, no country, no allies left to call on. Yet somehow he managed to vanish more completely than any high-ranking official. Most defectors left trails. Schmitt left none. It was as if he knew exactly how the net was cast and where to step to avoid every knot. The documents found in the cabin include passports bearing multiple names, forged identity cards, and maps marked in a hand that experts say match wartime OSS files. Whoever Schmitt was, he wasn't just running. He was hiding something, or protecting it. The question remains, Was Schmidt a traitor to the Reich, a loyal ghost of its last breath, or something far more dangerous, a man who served no country but his own agenda? Whatever the answer, he was no ordinary spy, and someone, for 74 years, wanted the world to forget he ever existed. By the spring of 1945, Germany was coming apart at the seams. Cities lay flattened, rail lines twisted into useless metal, and the Reich, that once boasted it would last 1,000 years, was dying in a matter of weeks. Roads overflowed with fleeing civilians, broken soldiers, and high-ranking officials desperate to burn their past before the Allies reached them. Fires consumed entire archives. Intelligence offices locked their doors and vanished overnight. Trucks full of documents disappeared into forests, ravines, and private estates, leaving behind nothing but ash and unanswered questions. It was in this maelstrom of collapse that Carl Schmidt moved like a shadow. While others panicked, Schmidt remained calm, too calm, some later said. He lingered in Berlin just long enough to collect a satchel of classified material, then slipped out hours before Soviet forces surrounded the city. From there, he bounced in and out of bombed-out train stations and commandeered vehicles, each sighting more fragmented than the last. Prague, Munich, a safe house outside Salzburg. No one could confirm whether he was running from someone or toward something. As Nazi officials begged for mercy or defected to whichever power would take them, Schmidt did neither. He refused surrender, he avoided capture, and he left no trail of destroyed records the way others did, as if he'd already hidden what mattered long before the war's end. On May 3rd, a young American intelligence officer filed a brief report, mostly ignored at the time, describing a German man in civilian clothing boarding a military transport truck near Innsbruck. The witness only noticed him because of the way he carried himself. Straight-backed, quiet, a man who seemed to know exactly where he was going. The report listed no name, just one detail. The man carried a leather briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. The truck drove south toward the Alps. No checkpoints logged its passage. No patrol reported intercepting it. And after that sighting, Schmidt evaporated. No body ever surfaced. No defection records. No post-war testimony. Just a single moment in the chaos, one man stepping into the back of a vehicle as the world around him collapsed, and then nothing for 74 years. But the truth, buried deep beneath Austrian snow and time, was waiting, and when it finally surfaced, it would reveal why Schmidt never returned. The cabin shouldn't have stood out. It was one of hundreds scattered through the Austrian Alps, weathered wood, sagging eaves, a chimney cold for years. The locals barely remembered the man who lived there. They called him a hermit, someone who came into town only once or twice a year for canned goods and kerosene. No friends, no family, no one to claim his belongings when he died alone in the winter of 2020. When the property went to the state, it was auctioned off quickly. A young buyer purchased it, imagining a quiet retreat, a place far from crowds and deadlines. The cabin was old but sturdy, the perfect fixer-upper. He planned to strip it down to the beams, modernize the interior, and turn it into a mountain escape. On the third day of renovations, he went into the basement, a low, cramped space lined with dusty shelves and decades of spiderwebs. The air smelled faintly of old paper and rusted metal. As he cleared debris, he noticed something peculiar. One wall didn't sound like the others when tapped. A hollow thud. Not wood, not stone, something in between. Curiosity got the better of him. A crowbar wedged into the seam. With a groan of nails and aged timber, the panel shifted, revealing a narrow hidden chamber behind it. Inside, the air was colder, as if sealed since the war. There were 3 crates, each marked with faded German script. Next to them stood 2 rusted filing cabinets, their drawers locked shut. A stack of film canisters, the metal mottled with age, sat neatly arranged as if waiting for someone who never returned. A leather-bound ledger rested atop one crate, its cover stamped with an insignia long since forgotten by most of the world. Authorities were called. Archivists arrived. Historians followed. What they found inside those crates, what they unspooled from those reels, would ignite one of the most shocking rediscoveries of post-war Europe. The documents were real. The dates matched the final months of the Reich. And the handwriting, signatures, and coded annotations all pointed to one name, one ghost, one man the world had forgotten. Carl Schmitt, the spy who vanished in 1946, had left behind something far more dangerous than a corpse. He had left the truth. When the locked crates were finally pried open, the smell that drifted out was unmistakable. Old paper, cold metal, and something else, time itself, trapped and unmoving for nearly 8 decades. Inside lay a chaotic yet deliberate arrangement of documents and objects, each item a thread leading back into the darkness of 1945. The archivists wore gloves, speaking in low voices, as if raising their volume might disturb whatever slept inside. The first layer consisted of folders tied with brittle twine, their corners softened by age. When opened, they revealed wartime photographs, grainy black and white images of train yards, border checkpoints, and faces blurred by motion. Some bore handwritten notes in margins, terse annotations in a slanted German script. Others were clearly surveillance shots. Diplomats stepping out of cars, uniformed officers exchanging parcels, strangers whose names have long since been lost to history. Beneath the photographs lay notebooks, dozens of them. Each was filled with dense, meticulous handwriting, coded entries, strings of seemingly random numbers, hand-drawn grids, symbols that resembled both military ciphers and personal shorthand. One notebook, marked only with a single letter S, contained sketches of safe houses across Europe, routes annotated with instructions like avoid April, intercept June contact, burn after delivery. Then there were the passports. Multiple identities, multiple nations. One bore the name Carl Schmitt. Another marked him as Swiss. Another Italian. A fourth, astonishingly, carried British stamps dating to early 1944. All featured the same man. A narrow face, hollow eyes, a subtle scar near the jawline. His expression never changed. Most pages in the crates were stamped in red ink. Top secret, Geheime Reichssache. Documents of this classification should have been destroyed long before the war ended. Yet here they were intact, preserved, hidden with purpose. They included memoranda from Abwehr Command, intercepted Allied communications, drafts of operations that either never happened or were erased from official history. And at the bottom of the final crate, resting in a metal box, was a sealed envelope. Its paper was thick, its edges hand-pressed. The addressee was a name unfamiliar to every historian present, a name that appeared in no registry, no military personnel file, no intelligence archive. Für A. Lenz. Who was A. Lenz? A handler? A lover? A superior? No one could answer. But as investigators soon learned, the envelope was only the beginning. The real secrets waited in the codes. The decoding team worked in silence, their desks crowded with magnifiers, scanners, and brittle notebooks whose ink had faded to a sickly brown. They quickly realized the archive was not a diary or an intelligence file, it was a labyrinth. Every number, every symbol, even the spacing of words carried weight. Schmitt hadn't just hidden his secrets. He had buried them under layers of encryption designed to withstand time and interrogation alike. The first breakthrough came from a notebook filled with repetitive phrases, nonsensical at first glance. But when the entries were cross-referenced with a set of old radio frequencies stored in another folder, patterns emerged. Hidden within the entries were embedded schedules, drop locations, and references to a mysterious directive labeled Operation Feuerlicht. The name meant nothing to Allied historians. No OSS archive mentioned it. No surviving MI6 documents hinted at it. It appeared nowhere in captured German intelligence records. Feuerlicht Firelight was a ghost operation, something conceived in total secrecy and then wiped from official accounts. Whatever it was, Schmidt had been at its center. More troubling were the cross-references. Within Schmidt's files were fragments of communications that matched British cipher formats. There were pages written in English, likely intended for MI6 drop points in Vienna. A few notes followed American OSS structure, referencing handlers known to have worked in Prague during the war's final months. And buried deeper in the archive were slips stamped with faint Cyrillic markings, NKVD formats, from the Soviet intelligence service. One man, 3 intelligence networks, all pulling at the same thread. Was Schmidt feeding information to all of them, playing them against one another? Or was he collecting intelligence to protect something far larger? A final coded sheet sent chills through the decoding team. It linked Feuerlicht to a list of names half German, half Allied, each annotated with symbols signifying status, crossed circles, black squares, empty triangles. The meaning of these symbols remains unknown. But beside Schmidt's own alias, the symbol was different. An unfilled circle with a single diagonal line. One analyst whispered what everyone else was thinking. He wasn't running from them, they were running from him. And still, the most dangerous document hadn't yet been opened. The sealed envelope addressed to A. Lenz sat in a climate-controlled box, untouched, waiting. Whatever was inside would reshape everything they thought they knew about Carl Schmidt and the war he never stopped fighting. It started as a whisper on a coded page, Operation Feuerlicht, Firelight. But the more investigators decrypted from Schmidt's archive, the more the name surfaced. Not as a single mission, but a constellation of moves, alliances, and betrayals that stretched beyond the final months of the war. Firelight wasn't just intelligence work, it was something else, slippery, shape-shifting, a weapon made of silence. At first, analysts assumed it was sabotage. Train derailments, false troop positions, forged orders to mislead advancing armies. But the deeper they went, the less it looked like military interference and more like psychological engineering. Schmidt's notes described specific targets: radio operators, mid-level diplomats, translators, civilian officials, people positioned not on the front lines, but behind them. People who could be manipulated without anyone noticing. One decoded file included a list of forged identities used across Switzerland, Spain, and Italy, countries known to have been hubs for Nazi escapees in the post-war exodus. One particular entry was chilling. M confirmed ratline access, Vatican cover active. It pointed toward the rumored post-war escape routes known as ratlines, shadowy pipelines run by sympathetic clergy and intelligence officers to funnel SS officers, scientists, and collaborators out of Europe. Odessa, short for Organisation der Ehemaligen SS Angehörigen, had long been dismissed as myth by some, paranoia by others. Schmidt's archive suggested otherwise. Firelight, it seemed, was designed not to fight the war, but to survive its aftermath. Schmidt's role was no longer limited to espionage. He was recruiting, transporting, erasing. There were notes on bribed border agents, altered ship manifests, and safe house rotations. One haunting phrase, scribbled in the margin of a decoded memo, stood out. "The war ends when we say it does." It begged a question no one wanted to ask. Had Carl Schmidt, and others like him, actively worked to undermine the Allied occupation? Had they been laying the foundation for a shadow network that continued operating beneath the surface of post-war Europe? If so, then Firelight wasn't just a mission, it was a doctrine. A belief that the Third Reich didn't die in 1945, it simply disappeared. But one detail kept surfacing in the coded pages, over and over again. A location. A city fractured by occupation and brimming with secrets. Wien, Vienna. The address had been scribbled onto the inside cover of a weathered ledger found in the cabin, almost overlooked. Margaretenstrasse, 61, Wien. a former residential building on the south side of Vienna, gutted by Allied bombing in 1945. Most of it had collapsed. The rest was sealed behind chain-link fencing and hazard warnings. But the handwriting was unmistakably Schmidt's. Under the address, he'd written just 2 words, Stilllichtpunkt, silent light point. In October 2022, a historical team, accompanied by forensic investigators, gained access to the property. The ground floor was little more than rubble and rotted beams. But behind a crumbling section of tile in the basement, they found a narrow crawl space that led to a compartment built into the wall. What was hidden there hadn't seen light since the war. Inside, 2 sealed tins of photographic negatives, 5 rotting notebooks, and a small leather pouch. The negatives, when developed, revealed grainy black and white photos of men and women entering buildings across Vienna in 1946. One was clearly American, a diplomat confirmed to have worked under the U.S. Occupation Authority. Another, chillingly, matched an NKVD file photo of a Soviet attaché who died of natural causes in 1947. Each image had a date and time scrawled in pencil. Surveillance. Professional, patient, precise. The notebooks confirmed the worst suspicions. Schmidt hadn't vanished in 1946. He had relocated. Entries continued well into 1948. Notes on movement patterns, code drops, meeting points in coffee houses that no longer existed. Several entries referenced firelight directly, one suggesting that Vienna had been a secondary node echo circuit, active through April 48. Signal held. But what signal, and to whom? Then came the pouch. Inside was a letter, half decayed but legible. V has confirmed continuation of mission parameters. A.L. still in possession. Eyes on Bern, Berlin, Trieste. Signed only with a symbol, an unfilled circle, crossed by a diagonal line. The same mark used beside Schmidt's name. It was the final confirmation. Schmidt hadn't been a relic of the war. He was something worse. A man who had survived it, adapted to the silence that followed, and kept working beneath the ruins of a divided continent. Vienna wasn't the end of his story. It was just another chapter. In the summer of 1952, a hiker stumbled upon something strange near the southern edge of Lake Vilsalpsee. A pristine glacial lake cradled in the Austrian Alps, not far from the German border. What caught his eye wasn't on the surface, but beneath it, a shape caught between rocks near the bottom, wrapped in fabric, unmoving. Divers from the local gendarmerie were summoned. What they pulled from the lake was a man, face bloated from time and water, his coat weighed down with stones sewn into the lining. No identification, no wallet, no papers. Only a rusted wristwatch, a cigarette tin, and a money clip containing outdated Reichsmarks worthless by then. The body was catalogued, photographed, and sent for autopsy. Cause of death, drowning. Manner of death, undetermined. Suicide perhaps, or something else. The case file was stamped ungeklärt, unsolved, and quietly shelved. For decades, no one thought to revisit it. Until now. As the investigation into the Schmidt archive deepened, forensic teams began cross-referencing recovered materials for DNA and fingerprint traces. One partial print, smudged on the corner of a forged Swiss ID, triggered a match in a decades-old West German police archive. It belonged to the unidentified man from Lake Vilsalpsee. The body had decomposed too far for DNA at the time. But the fingerprint, recovered during the initial 1952 exam and preserved on file, had survived. And now it told a different story. The coat had been tailored not off the rack, but custom-made, with hidden pockets sewn into the lining. One of those pockets, never fully explored in the original investigation, contained a small plastic sleeve with thin carbon pages, fused together from years of moisture. Inside were fragments of codes and a single name, Lenz. The same name found on the sealed envelope in Schmidt's archive. Was the body Schmidt's? Forensic facial reconstruction software suggests it could be. Age range, bone structure, and height are consistent. But if it was him, if he truly died in 1952, then who wrote the Vienna entries dated 2 years later? One theory haunts the team. The man in the lake wasn't Schmidt, but someone pretending to be him. Or worse, someone silenced to protect the real Schmidt, who might have still been working, still watching from somewhere else. Not all the documents in Schmidt's archive were German. Some were written in clean, clipped English, typed on a Remington noiseless with formatting typical of U.S. Army intelligence dispatches. Others bore British routing codes, addresses in Kent and Sussex, signatures redacted with thick blocks of ink. One cable, dated October 1946, simply read, "Asset confirmed, Phase 2 viable, Firelight integration to proceed under joint control." The phrase, joint control, sent ripples through the investigation. It implied collaboration not among Germans, but between Schmidt and his former enemies. The suggestion that Schmidt, or whatever name he operated under by then, had been absorbed into post-war Allied intelligence. At first, it seemed absurd. But the circumstantial evidence mounted quickly. One document referred to a foreign specialist embedded with British Security Coordination, BSC, in Lisbon during 1947, a time when BSC was allegedly disbanded. Another file mentioned a handler in Trieste who logged meetings with a K.S. twice a month under diplomatic cover, and in the sealed envelope addressed to A. Lenz, a typed message, encoded but now partially decrypted, read, "Mission intact, Western partners unknowing or complicit. Third track viable if pact holds." What was the third track? And who were the partners? The troubling theory surfaced fast, that Schmidt had been protected, sheltered, perhaps even utilized. The Allies had motive, Cold War tensions were mounting, and the scramble for intelligence on Soviet movements became more important than prosecuting mid-level Nazi operatives. Schmidt had knowledge, connections, and most importantly, leverage. Could a man like him, deeply embedded in Nazi networks, fluent in enemy tactics, already operating under multiple identities, have been too valuable to destroy? It wouldn't have been the first time. Operation Paperclip proved the U.S. was willing to recruit former Nazis for scientific and strategic gain. Britain and the Soviets had done the same, quietly, pragmatically, and with full knowledge of what these men had once done. But Schmidt wasn't a scientist, he was a manipulator of systems, a ghost in the wires. If he'd worked for both sides, played each against the other, then the story wasn't just about a spy who vanished. It was about a war that never really ended, just shifted shape. The question no one wanted to ask now hung in the air. Had the victors inherited not just Nazi secrets, but Nazi agents? The fallout began quietly. A historian in Berlin cross-referenced Schmidt's archive with the BND's restricted files and found something impossible. Names long thought dead, some executed for war crimes, others lost in presumed suicide, listed instead as relocated assets. A retired French intelligence officer's signature appeared on a document authorizing safe passage through Marseille in 1947. A British diplomat's initials, long denied any post-war involvement with Nazi figures, surfaced beside an entry marked Operation Feuerlicht Political Channel Secure. What had started as a cold case was now a diplomatic firestorm. Within weeks, the story leaked. Journalists pounced on the connection between Schmidt's files and the Vatican-linked rat lines. Names were redacted, then unredacted. Reporters tracked down descendants of men listed in the documents, some of whom now sat in government, banking, or intelligence roles themselves. The past, once buried in snow and silence, had claws, and it was dragging the present down with it. Families denied everything. Governments refused comment. But archival records don't lie. In the margins of the documents were connections no one wanted to see, code words, bank accounts, foreign visas issued under false names. One British family, long celebrated for their wartime resistance work, discovered their patriarch had been running messages between Schmidt and Soviet contacts in 1949. A well-known Cold War hero turned out to be the courier for a man the world thought dead. The implications rippled outward. Operations classified for over 70 years were now under review. Museums updated exhibits. History textbooks were quietly edited. Debates exploded in university lecture halls and parliament chambers. Had the post-war order been built on compromises too disturbing to admit? Had peace been purchased with silence? More troubling still, portions of Schmidt's records contained notes in handwriting that didn't match his. Handwriting dated decades after his presumed death. Someone else had accessed the archive, continued it, possibly updated it, which meant Schmidt's reach hadn't ended in the 1,940 seconds, or even the 50 seconds. Beneath the headlines and historical reckonings, one terrifying truth emerged. History isn't just written by the victors, sometimes it's edited by the survivors. There is a saying whispered among the remnants of the intelligence world. The war ends when the last lie is told. But what if the lies never stopped? As Schmidt's archive was digitized and classified under international review, the teams studying it were forced to confront something uncomfortable. The deeper they went, the less sense it all made. Some files were incomplete. Others were written in cipher systems. No one could crack notations that referenced operations not found in any Allied or Axis record. Whole folders were missing, yet cataloged, suggesting someone had removed them long after the war. Some names were blacked out by ink that tested as less than 20 years old. And then there were the pages written in two hands. One Schmidt's, the other unknown. Who continued his work? And why? Each answer bred new questions. Had Schmidt truly died at Lakeville, Salpsey? Or had he faked his death using a proxy, another ghost sacrificed for silence? If so, where did he go? Some believe he lived for decades in South America. Others think he was folded permanently into a NATO shadow unit. A few believe he never left Austria, that he stayed close to the cabin, guarding the archive like a tomb. None of it could be proven. But nothing could be ruled out either. One photo remained at the center of the case, a black and white image pulled from the Vienna cache. In it, a man, face obscured by shadow, stands at a window overlooking a snowy mountain range. No timestamp, no writing on the back, just one detail. The jacket he wears is identical to the one found on the body in Lakeville, Salpsey. Except in this photo, it's dry, untouched, worn like armor. The snow continues to fall in the Austrian highlands. The cabin, now cleared of its secrets, sits silent once more. Renovations were never completed. The property was quietly seized by the federal government, then listed as under environmental review. No one has bought it since. Locals say the mountain is cursed, that sometimes near twilight a light flickers in the cellar, and if you stand far enough back in the tree line just before the snow erases your tracks, you might see a figure standing in the upper window, still, watching. Because some wars never end, and some ghosts never leave. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.